at this point in Eldridge, it's about, say, a mile behind me. And so at some point, Byler Road will cross, the original Byler Road will be crossing Highway 13. So we're anxious to see these places along. There are stops along the way that we want to be familiar with so we can see this historic road. Apparently this turnpike, it was the first in Alabama. We'll be telling you more about that as the day goes on and we meet up with Joel Mize.
Ceatham Road was authorized about 1825, so it was authorized about 5 years after the Byler Road was, so there was a lot of hustle and bustle, and Tuscaloosa was a very prominent place to go, particularly after Alabama decided to put the capital there. So the capital went down to Cahaba first, and had problems down there with fire and floods, and they moved up to Tuscaloosa. Having the state capital of Tuscaloosa really made those roads because that was a central destination for virtually everybody who had serious business in the state of Alabama. They had their attorneys in Tuscaloosa. That was the place to go to get things done.
This was the first turnpike in the state of Alabama. And apparently it tracked along an old Indian path. But we will be hearing more about Muscle Shoals.
We actually are in the east end of Muscle Shoals. It's kind of the county part of Muscle Shoals. And we are at a point called Bainbridge here, where the old Bainbridge ferry used to run. And it was the dividing point between what was called the Big Muscle Shoals, where the river flowed over big rapids coming from Decatur downriver. And from this point southward is called the Little Muscle Shoals. So this is indeed the true heart of what was the original Muscle Shoals.
Oh my.
Now the mussels, are these little shellfish that grew in the river, and the Indians would harvest them. That was a diet from the early primitive Indians here, and they would actually build big mounds with just the mussel shells. So when TVA first flooded the river here.
About what year, Joel?
This is in the 1930s. This is after Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided that there needed to be a master plan to use some of the facilities that were built here in World War I and put people to work in the South. And so the WPA and others came in and did a lot of work, and archaeologists were hired to look at all the Indian remains that were out in the river. And roughly between, say, 10 miles north of here to 10 miles south of here, they actually uncovered about 100 skeletons of the ancient Indians, a lot of Indian artifacts. The Indians did ceremonial burials in these mounds. And if you haven't seen it, you'll want to make a trip to see the Indian Mound Museum in Florence. It's just been kind of fully redone, and it's got some marvelous presentations of what the early Indian life was like here. And the Indians indeed inhabited this area as long as 10 to 12,000 years ago. And we know that because of diggings that have been done. We're going to be passing by the LaGrange Historical Preservation Area where Indian Cave Shelter was located. There's another over further west in the county that's known as the Stanfield Worley Dig, which is real famous. The very first radiocarbon dating ever done in Alabama was done here in 1961 to date the Indian campfires, if you will, from that particular location. So this is a very historic place, and it's had people in and out of here for 10 to 12,000 years. And indeed, it was a trading path between Mobile and the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, because a lot of the trinkets found in the mounds here come from those distant places. So you know they had to have a trading system in order to get those trade goods into here.
Okay, now the old Byler Road, did that start here?
The old Byler Road, which was Alabama's first authorized road by the state. There were a couple of pioneer trails in here before the Byler, but the pioneer was determined as needed and to be built 2 days after Alabama became a state. The state legislature was meeting in Huntsville, and they put this as a priority of something that needed to be done. So the Jackson Military Road was just being completed. It was built between 1816 and 1820. So the specification by the legislature was that the Byler Road was to start on the west bank of Shoals Creek. And Shoals Creek out right over here. So west bank of Shoals Creek, but it's about 10 miles north of the riverbank over there, was where the Jackson Military Road crossed Shoals Creek. So it came down there through Bailey Springs and ended up in what's called North Bainbridge on the other side of the river. And then there was a narrows here, which was the narrowest part of the Tennessee River, which was a channel, and you could cross in about 15 minutes here. And so Campbell put in a ferry here before Alabama became a state, and that was called Campbell's Ferry. And you take Campbell's Ferry, and then the road was built north of Campbell's Ferry up to the crossing of Jackson Military Road at Shoals Creek, and south of here all the way to Tuscaloosa, but through this point. So we'll be riding on this road, this very historic road, earliest in Alabama. There actually was a road here before statehood from the foot of Campbell's Ferry here, a little bit to the southwest of here, and it intercepted an even earlier road called Gaines Trace. Gaines Trace was a road 1808 and 1810. So some 10 years before statehood, the Gaines Trace got built. And George Washington was instrumental in negotiating the treaty for Gaines Trace to be built. And he built a cotton called Meldon's Bluff, 12 miles to the east of here, for the Cherokee Indians and Chief Doublehead. And then he built another cotton gin down at Cotton Gin Port, Mississippi, which he built for one of the Chickasaw chiefs. And it was the Indians' bypass of the Shoals, because they too knew about the magic of cotton, and cotton was a wonderful material, very much in demand all over Europe, where they built these fancy mills to process cotton and make it into clothing. And so the highest and best price in the world for cotton was over there. And so the Indians got in on the act by building Gaines Trace, and a young Lieutenant James Pendleton Gaines surveyed that route. And it's important in the story of the Byler, because the Byler crosses the Gaines Trace. It was also important pre-Alabama. So we'll be talking about a little bit of all of that today. So one of the more important things about this location has to do with the Civil War period. Hood's army, as you know, was actually the residual army of General Johnston, Battle of Atlanta. And in effect, the city of Atlanta was given up so that the army could be saved. So the Union was allowed to go in and capture Atlanta, but the troops wanted to fight again. So they changed generals, and Hood took over. Recently written a little treatise. You'll find it on the Tennessee Valley Historical Society website that deals with the Palmer raid. So Union General Palmer, as Hood was retreating into this location, Palmer took a train out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, down to Decatur. And the Confederates brought over some pontoon boats that they had left over at Decatur and put with those that Hood was bringing with him. Hood had to abandon a number of his pontoon wagons, so they didn't have enough pontoons to cross here. So they had to get the 20 or so pontoons out of Decatur in order to get across the river. They barely made it around Christmas Day of 1864. The weather was freezing. The men were wading streams to get back here. Their shirts were freezing on them. It was a pretty sad situation. So you had the tattered army crossing right here at Bainbridge and heading south with 310 wagons. All 310 wagons were run down by Union cavalry. 200 of them were run down just to the west of Russellville, 10 miles out of Russellville, and 200 wagons and about 1,000 mules were burned and the mules killed with bayonets. The 110 wagons were taken to Iuka, Mississippi, with the main force of the men. The wagons that got run down first were doing a cross country down the Gaines Trace. The other wagons were intercepted over in Mississippi, and they were burned, and those mules were bayoneted likewise. So it was a big loss for Hood's army, and it really set the stage for Alabama being very vulnerable to being invaded, which was done a few months later by General Wilson and his troops. So again, this is a very historic crossing. Particularly the Byler Road was a central way of traveling to the heart of Alabama. So the Wilson's cavalry troops actually organized themselves downstream of here over at Waterloo and a place called Gravelly Springs in Lauderdale County. They crossed the river at Cherokee and a place called Chickasaw or Riverton, and then they came through the Byler and also through another road called the Gaines Trace Fork into Russellville, and from there they then went on into Jasper, and from Jasper they actually went in 3 prongs down to Jasper. They had a prong that came down the Somerville Road to Arkadelphia, headed for Jasper. They had a main group coming. Actually, General Wilson followed this group down the Byler Road here into the Bankhead Forest, and while in the Bankhead Forest, he was with Upton's 2nd Division, and Upton went on down straight to Jasper by way of Clear Creek Falls. And however, General Wilson actually peeled off and went down to Townley, Alabama, which then had a different name. I've forgotten what Townley's name was during the war. And then the other group, Croxton and his raiders with McCord's 1st Division, went to Eldridge and then took a road from Eldridge into Jasper, and they all converged at Jasper, and from Jasper is where the main campaign south was launched. So all of this ties in. These are feeder roads coming in to the heart of Alabama, and there's a lot of history on these roads and the horses and the men. The convoy of Hood's army, when he was retreating out of the Battle of Nashville, the 19,000 men he had left, was over 10 miles long. So this is a long convoy of men and wagons and animals, etc.
On the Byler Road.
On the Byler Road. On the Byler Road, crossing it, a very important part of the South final surrender.
All right, Joel, that's most interesting.
One little factoid I wanted to mention to you is that Jesse and Frank James robbed the U.S. government payroll at this point called Bainbridge here. Bainbridge was the first town that began to be built here on the Tennessee River, just prior to statehood and just after statehood. So it actually came along before Florence and Tuscumbia began to spring up. And it turned out that with Jackson Military Road, the population shifted there rather than here. So this was going to be the population center here of northwest Alabama, but it ended up being a little bit further downstream.
Okay.
All right. So Jesse and Frank got away with their bank robbery.
About what year was that?
The government was building a canal on the other bank, and this was I don't know the exact year of that, but of course it was after the Civil War when they were into their robbing trains and the like, and Jesse ended up dying before this came to trial, but Frank went on trial over in Huntsville, and he was defended and represented by one of the Alabama governors, Governor Smith, out of Randolph County, Alabama. He was a carpetbagger governor. He was an son of Alabama, but during the Reconstruction period, Smith was one of our first governors, and he was a lawyer and defended Frank James, and Frank James got off with that robbery.
Oh my! Just a little tidbit.
Just a little tidbit. The fellow who lived in this old house here lived here until the Korean War, and he went away. And there used to be a big cistern out there where they would feed water the horses for the stagecoach stop. And after the war, the stagecoach stop was turned into a church building for a number of years. But there was just one readable cemetery stone left some 20 years ago when people have reported to me, and it was for Sarah Peden, who died in 1861. And the legend around here is that she was poisoned by her slaves.
Oh my.
Yeah. Now, whether that legend is true or not, God only knows. That she's buried in a little cemetery out there that's the Peden family cemetery. And there are about 40 graves out there, 40 or 50. None of them, they've been kind of plowed over and torn up, and there's just a couple of cemetery stones left, and her stone has disappeared in the last 20 years.
But that cistern was nearby.
Cistern was right there in the middle of that field, and the big old Traveler's Inn, stagecoach house, if you will, was right there in the edge of that field.
Any idea the stagecoach line name?
Actually, the main stage operation was done around Larissa in Winston County. And the family of Ferrises operated the stage line from there, and they drove south to Tuscaloosa, and they drove north first here to the Tennessee River and up to the Jackson Military Road, and later they morphed the road over to Cortland because that became the legal center of this south of the river area.
Can we put a time frame on the period of time that operated?
Yes. First of all, John Byler, Captain John Byler, who was originally of North Carolina and built roads in North Carolina before the War of 1812 and the Creek Indian War. He was selected to be one of the major road builders of building the Jackson Military Road from New Orleans to Nashville. And that road was finished in 1820. Well, he rolled over from building that road to building this road. So it was authorized in December 1819, but he began construction in 1820. And it took 4 years to build the road. So the road was completely finished by 1824, but actually it was semi-operational as early as 1822. So that's the time frame when that was done.
Now, these big trees, they are...
This is about 300 years 200 old. Years. So the road that we're traveling today is 200 years old. And so that was probably a good-sized tree when this road was built. And it is a kind of an unusual species here. It's not normally found here. It is a cherry bark oak, and its natural habitat is in the lower province of the Mississippi River from about Memphis south. That's where it normally grows. How it got here, nobody knows. But it is the largest of its kind in the state of Alabama. It's about 23 feet in circumference.
Well, it's impressive, and you notice it right away. I did.
You do. You see the limbs hanging to the ground. Those are unusual. I'd seen the live oaks in Mobile and Biloxi and whatever that hang down like that, but it's unusual with limbs that grow to the ground like these have. On either side of the road, as we go the next half mile, that the road is depressed. It's got banks up on either side, and you can see the tree roots growing from the bank down into the road. And that is classic of a road that's been there a long time. And remember, those 310 wagons that crossed at Bainbridge came right down this road. And as they did, every time those wheels turned, they picked up a little more mud, and that mud would kind of go with them, and that's what makes a depression like that in the old roads.
My. Okay. But the very beginning was at the edge of the river?
The very beginning is actually north there in Lauderdale County, but it wasn't convenient for us to go do that section.
Oh, okay.
And that runs from the Jackson Military Road at Shoals Creek, and it came down through Bailey Springs to North Bainbridge, which is on the north side of the river, and we were standing on the south side of the river where the main Bainbridge town was located. But that's about 10 miles of upper road that we didn't visit. So we started as far north as you can get in Colbert County, and now we're following the track that takes us to Tuscaloosa, because this road was built to take people to Tuscaloosa. You've got 100 feet of water depth there that's held up by the Wilson Dam. The Wilson Dam was built to be 142 feet tall, and so that stretch of river is considered one of the greatest natural resources of the United States, because it has enough drop in the river and enough water flow through the river to make a wonderful source for hydroelectric power. Thus, 2 dams got built. The Wheeler Dam upstream was built and put into operation in 1936, but the Wilson Dam started actually in World War I, and it was finished in 1924. So the 2 of those dams in combination make a huge amount of electricity, around 750,000 horsepower or thereabouts of electrical power.
Quite a power source.
As you know, Alabamans are enterprising people themselves and build a side road off to the side to skirt around the toll booths.
Do you know some of those? I had heard Ceatham Road was one.
Yeah, Ceatham Road ended up being a competing road that came down through Moulton to Double Springs and then on to Tuscaloosa. So it was a competing one that was built about 4 years after the Byler Road.
Okay, that answers a lot of questions from local people in Walker County.
Yes.
Walker, Winston, we're right on the line.
Was commissioned by the state of Alabama in 1824 to build a road from this area to Tuscaloosa. He moved a couple of times from Lawrence County, but he wanted property where Ceatham Road crossed over Clear Creek, and that's where he built a home and a tavern. This historical marker commemorates the beginning of the Ceatham Road. This is County Road 327, and the old college was on this road, and it says Ceatham Road. So the old Ceatham Road, we assumed, was now County Road 327. So the old college would have been in this area on the Ceatham Road. Church and cemetery are located. In a book by Pat Morrison about a picture postcard book of Walker County sites, there was an old 2-story hotel, brick hotel, nice buildings. The old hotel supposedly was destroyed around 1910-12, and local people don't even remember any such hotel, but it was in existence. There was a picture postcard record of it. I have a map, a satellite map of the area, an old one, and it shows Flatwood Cemetery, and we're trying to locate Ceatham Road, which went parallel to the old Byler Road, and at some spots it might have even crossed. And
Road Visits is a private home in Winston County with some amazing rock art.
Doing my homework along the Byler Road to kind of see what's out there, and I stumbled across this magnificence here. Probably a number of years ago, but not that long ago, in the last 6 or 7 years. I've discovered, particularly back during the 1970s when we had energy shortage, the mines really cranked up around here. So it may go back as much as 50 years now, because he was out there working the mines during the period of the 70s. And but I think it was maybe later 70s, 80s when he started his place.
Is this not a treasure trove? What this man has done with rock is just incredible. Did you notice these swings over here? The places, the road 13 took over, but you can still see Byler Road or different places.
And there was an old stagecoach stop up here. Eldridge Mallard is the man for whom Eldridge is named, and he had a tavern up here, and we'll try to locate that a little later on. But I guess if we want to talk about the Byler Road, we got to go way back. What I like to think about is why the Byler Road, or why there was a road between the Tennessee River and why it ended down at the Black Warrior River, what is now North Port, Tuscaloosa. Well, there was, the crossing to get across the Tennessee River. There were the shoals up here at Cortland. It went all the way to Muscle Shoals. Okay, so that's where down here at North Port, Tuscaloosa, they had the crossing there. It was called the Falls of the Black Warrior, and you could cross the river there. And so, even before, it was on December 16th, 1819, 2 days after Alabama became a state, Governor William Wyatt Bibb signed into legislation an act saying John Byler could build the first public road in Alabama. So it was 2 days after Alabama became a state. That's one of the first things the first governor, William Wyatt Bibb, did, was to enact legislation for a public road known as the Byler Road.
So we're right at the edge of Winston and Walker County here. And then if you follow this road and go back around and take a right, you'll go by Spring Hill Cemetery. And that's where my Barnabas Kelly, my third great-grandfather, is buried. And just some this is an old settlement. This is part of Walker County and Winston County that was settled many, many years ago, 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Byler Road is a street over from us, that way. It goes up back by McDonald's and back this way and came out. And at the end of the street is the Feldman Building, which is built in 19 10 by John Dodd. And the Byler Road went behind there and went down what we call Alabama Avenue, and then goes over the railroad tracks and goes down through South Haleyville and comes back out on 13. This is where the main street was, and like I said, Byler, there was an old blacksmith shop back over here. I can remember it.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you all are here. The Byler Road was an amazing project, as Mr. Joel has already explained, and it is so much more than that, because before it was ever Byler Road, I know that you know many places along that were Native American trails and wild game trails, and that's amazing that man took and made a road from where the animals walked, right? I mean, the animals were smart enough to use it as a trail, so why shouldn't we? But also, just in general, all along the Byler Road, there's so much rich history, and I know you all have discovered that for sure today. And that was, I know, Joel and Wheeler's passion, along with the other group that has worked so diligently on bringing back to light this rich history. We all across our state and surrounding areas have a very, very long and rich history. Isn't that right, Mr. Joel?
Yes, we've been here at least 10,000 years.
That's right.
In this state of Alabama.
But, of course, as you all know, and if you didn't know, you have decided by now, my passion is doing the living history for none other than the infamous Aunt Jenny. So I'm going to tell you about her today, and then even some of her ways of life, and that's where these herbs come in. So when we get done, please feel free to hang around and ask me any questions. Okay? So with that, we're going to get started. Aunt Jenny was born Louisa Elizabeth Jane Bates. She was born in Kentucky. She was more than likely at least half Cherokee Indian, as her mother was Annie Brown and was said to have been a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. But Aunt Jenny, she was really no different than any of the rest of us. She was very, very young when she set her eye upon Mr. Willis Brooks and decided right then and there that he was going to be her husband. And he did, even though he was 20 years her senior. They moved into what we now know as the Bankhead area. Before it was called the Bankhead National Forest, most of that area was known as the Black Warrior.
Yes.
And most of this area was known as the Black Warrior Mountains, and of course, as you all know, about the Black Warrior River. The main story that I usually hear is that there was a skirmish that took place along the Byler Road, and that there were Union soldiers left that laying dead. It was said that they told them, "You leave them laying. You let the varmints and the vultures have them. They don't deserve a decent burial." But now I ask you, who would leave dead bodies? Doesn't matter if they're your enemy or what. You're not going to leave them. And neither did they. And the story goes is that they buried those. And then it enraged the Confederate Army. And they said, well then, if you're not for us, you must be against us. Isn't that right, Mr. Payne? Therefore, they came in, and it is said that they took Mr. Willis Brooks, Aunt Jenny's husband, and they took him and brutally murdered him after torturing him. It is either at the same time or two different instances, but they also did Aunt Jenny's young son, John, the same way. He was only 19 years old, but of course he was old enough to serve, right? And it is said that that is where Aunt Jenny's legend begins. Some say it was because of that native blood coursing through her veins. Some say it was simply because she was devastated and shell-shocked, and that she was a mother and a wife, simply. Some also speculate that it was because some of those men could have at one time been friends or possibly neighbors. But nonetheless, this is where Aunt Jenny set in a vengeance that would follow her family for more than 3 to 4 decades. It spanned all the way down through her remaining sons, son-in-laws, and grandsons. And yes, I will say that I'm sure if Aunt Jenny were here with you today, she would tell you that her vengeance and her rage cost her way more than it was ever worth. By the time Aunt Jenny died, at the age of 98 in 1926, all of her 10 children were gone but one. She had lost many grandchildren, and again, daughters, son-in-laws, and the list goes on. Oh, there are so many legends that are tied to that.
Traveling the Old Byler Road in Tuscaloosa County at Northport, an interesting stop is the site of the John Welch Pruitt plantation, which covered 6,000 acres. The home burned in the 1940s. A slave cemetery with over 300 graves is still visited by descendants. According to available information from Tuscaloosa Genealogical Society, slaves were treated kindly by the Pruitt family. They were allowed to own their own farm animals and raise their own crops. Mrs. Pruitt's wife, Betsy, ran a commissary store, and her only restriction was that everyone had to be clean and have on clean clothing to shop there. The Old Byler Road tours will open in Tuscaloosa at the site of the Capitol building ruins. It was situated just a short walk from the Warrior River and accessible by boat transportation. Most traveled by horseback, wagons, buggies, and stagecoaches on the Byler Road.
We envision that Byler Road will become part of a larger entity to be known as the Alabama Trail. Bill Clemens and I are working on something similar for the Muscle Shoals. We call it Shoals area, Revolutionary War Patriots that chose Alabama as their home location. We have about 60 names on our list, and we're well toward doing a book that would feature and highlight some summary of the Revolutionary War, of what it was about, some of the major battles of that war, but feature stories on each one of the Patriot soldiers that we've identified that lived in our area.
Do you think this is a replacement for an older one?
I believe so. I believe that's what I understand. That there was another one that was destroyed or damaged. And
Oh, okay. Well, that's very nice.
A lovely park has been created on the grounds surrounding the structure remains, where the state capitol business was conducted for 20 years from 1826 to 1846. The capital moved to Montgomery in 1847. The first Alabama state capitol was located at Cahaba in 1819. The move to Tuscaloosa in 1826 was prompted by repeated Cahaba River flooding.
No, it was destroyed. Nothing to do with the occupation or anything like that. It just basically fell down into ruins over time.
But,
So,
legislature left in 1840.
1846, yes. So, the building actually had 4 entrances. You can see there was an entrance on the south side where, well, that happens to be the east side. This is the north side. The other end is the south side, and over here is the west side. And those settlers coming to the Byler Road came down Main Avenue, our old Byler, right down the middle of Northport, crossed over by transport of some sort, probably a ferry or pull boat across the river, and the river's edge is right there at the shadow line. That walkway down there is actually part of the river walk of Tuscaloosa. So it was merely a matter of stepping off the river crossing transport, coming up the hill, going straight into the Capitol building. So this indeed is the real end of the Byler Road here at Alabama's State Capitol building from 1826 to 1846. And indeed, that was the period in which the Byler was heaviest used in that 20 years. And remember, the developers of the road were only paid for the first 10 years of tolls. So the second 10 years, they had little incentive to keep up the road. And even though the road was built well enough that it lasted into the 1900s, nevertheless, it also was left in ruins to some degree, so that when the state capitol shut down, the use of that road as a central corridor of transportation was not acutely needed as it was prior, when this was a bustling place of Alabama government.